Today I want to discuss with you what's happened to the Pakistani economy since we have begun to enact structural adjustment policies that were promoted and were advocated by international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Whenever we talk about the main issues with Pakistan's economy, especially if you talk about it on social media or other such platforms, one of the answers that you discover that comes up most frequently is that we were doing absolutely fine, we were doing fantastic, till Bhutto's nationalization destroyed economic development. This is a very common refrain. And recently you may even have heard the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, having stated this in his speech that he made in Turkey and then several other speeches he made in Pakistan, where he said, nationalization is the reason why Pakistan's economy is not growing. This kind of economic analysis is what I call a knee-jerk economic analysis. It's really not looking at the data, it's really not looking at what's going on in the economy, and it's really not even very up to date. If it were the case that nationalization destroyed Pakistan's economy, then we would not have seen Pakistan's economy either grow in the early Bhutto period, nor would we have seen Pakistan's economy grow in the 1980s, because Ziaul Haq obviously did not reverse the nationalization of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and yet the economy grew quite rapidly. If we look at the overall data with respect to Pakistan's economy, we see that the big slowdown in Pakistan's economy really begins in the 1990s. It's the 1990s where we begin to see nearly every major economic indicator slowly dropping off. And yet, aside from a small handful of economists who say that structural adjustment policies are responsible for the slowdown in Pakistan's economy, the majority of economists even today continue to repeat the idea that an excessive large government sector is to blame for Pakistan's economic slowdown, even when such a large government sector, as they claim, simply does not even exist anymore. So what we're going to do in today's lecture is we're going to first look at the situation with respect to large-scale manufacturing. Then we're going to look at the situation with respect to small-scale manufacturing. And then finally, we are going to move on to textiles and specifically power, which in my view is one of the key factors that causes the slowdown and is continuing to cause the slowdown in Pakistan's economy. And yet, fascinatingly, nobody identified it in the quiz, which is not surprising since we haven't really even discussed it in the course as yet. So let's begin with large-scale manufacturing, as it were. I'm going to use the shorthand LSM for large-scale manufacturing, just so that you're aware. Now, we can see what is happening with the industrial sector. We can break it up into mining, manufacture, large-scale, small-scale, slaughtering, construction, electricity, whatever we want. And the trend is very, very clear. The trend is, of course, very high rates of growth in the 50s and 1960s. Although the 50s high rates of growth we should take with a pinch of salt because the base is actually very small. But the 60s high rates of growth are quite significant and no doubt are really quite significant in terms of the structural transformation of Pakistan's economy. We see a dip in the 1970s, but mainly, in my opinion, that dip is driven by OPEC and what's going on over there. And then we see a very big revival in the 1980s, which is curious because there is no massive privatization of the economy in this period. In fact, from this period to this period, whatever has been nationalized in sum pretty much remains nationalized. And then from this period onwards, and from the 1990s onwards, we see a secular or a progressive slowdown of the economy with some booms and bumps in the middle thanks to the war on terror and the assistance we get. But the overall trend, it's specifically in terms of manufacture, is for a slowdown, as you can clearly see from the data over here, which is slowing down in comparison to the data over here. In fact, the growth rates of the 1990s onwards are much slower than the growth rates even of the 1970s. So we have been discussing large-scale and small-scale manufacturing, and we had a lively, very important discussion and debate about it. And in such debates, it is natural and inevitable that people who are on one side of the spectrum versus the other side of the spectrum will be forced into a position where they are defending their positions over and above any other argument from the other side, being unwilling to concede some things to the other side. But let's take a brief recap of that debate and where we stand with respect to that. What is large-scale manufacturing in Pakistan? Mostly it is textiles that we're talking about. Let's just be very clear in our picture, in our mind. What is it that we're talking about? We're talking about textiles. At the second level, we're talking about food and tobacco. Right? Pakistan tobacco is a massive. We used to love smoking cigarettes, etc. Right? Most of large-scale manufacture is essentially private. 3/4 of the gross fixed capital formation is dominated by the private sector. So we're not talking about, when we talk about large-scale manufacturing as a whole, we're not talking about the government sector because most of it is dominated today by the private sector. Let's be mentally clear on this picture. LSM varies enormously depending on the commissioning of large projects. Every single time a big project is commissioned, suddenly you will see large-scale manufacturing jump up. And then when big projects are not commissioned, large-scale manufacturing goes down. So it is highly closely correlated with big projects and whether or not they are commissioned or not. That's very important to recognize because a government can actually push up large-scale manufacturing by ensuring the commissioning of either government or private large-scale projects. That's where the key is at, right? LSM, of course, is capital intensive, no surprise there at all. You're using high technology, productivity of labor is very high. You can also, that means that despite the fact that in value terms it grows very quickly, and in percentage of GDP terms it grows very quickly, it does not actually generate an equivalent amount or a proportionate amount of employment. So you can see that while Pakistan's population doubles, the number employed in industry went up by only a quarter, by less than half of that. So it's difficult for large-scale manufacture to keep pace with that. Employment mainly occurs, therefore, in the small-scale sector. So as I told you, the formal sector is capital intensive, and you can see that over here. You can look at the capital stock that's available to the formal sector and compare it to the capital stock available to the informal, to the small scale, and to the household. This is the micro sector, right? And you can see there's a huge difference in the data over here entirely. And it shows you very clearly that the large-scale sector is incredibly capital intensive, which is also why it generates a lot of output, but not that much employment. And specifically, we were talking about because large-scale sector is mainly private, that's why it does not generate the employment. Because any capitalist, when they're investing, will create employment in the proportion to which they're able to sell their commodities. Whereas if the large-scale sector was, let's say, dominated by the government, it would be able to generate high levels of employment as well as generating high levels of productivity. So as I told you, the other major thing, let's look at the data. LSM is built around textiles. 1/4 of total production measured by value addition is essentially textile production. And if you add cotton-related activity, this is much even greater than that. Around a third of Pakistan's export earnings come also from cotton textiles and cotton-related products. Another third of it comes now from remittances and so on, right? So here's the data of total yarn produced, total cloth production, etc. You can look at the overall data, etc. over here. Now, the World Bank considers that the textile industry in Pakistan is perhaps the most efficient industry within Pakistan. Please be aware that they're not calling Pakistani textile industry the most efficient textile industry in the world, but comparing the Pakistan textile industry to other industries within Pakistan, the textile industry is very, very efficient. How many of you have been to a textile mill? All right, so I think we should arrange a visit to a good Pakistani textile mill, and you'll be able to see that you will feel like you're in some other part of the world. You're not in Pakistan when you look at the degree of organization, the machinery, the technology, and even the way in which those mills are quite well organized. So in terms of the number of spindles, it is ranked 4th in the world, and in terms of as being a cotton yarn producer, it is ranked 12th in the world. Very, very high, in fact, right? And here you can see the number of mills in Pakistan, 436 over here. the number of spindles that are working. The percentage of those spindles that are installed that are working varies from the high 70s all the way up to the 90s, etc. Right? And similarly, you can see with respect to looms, the number of looms that are involved, the number that are working, and the number that in percentage that are working. Here the numbers don't seem very high. Specifically over here, you can see that they're only operating at half their capacity. And we'll look at utilization of capacity in just a little while. So in the 1960s, in the decade of the 1960s, Pakistan was at number 11. Sorry, no, my mistake. Pakistan cornered 11% of the world market on cotton. That's really quite high, right? Now this slipped down to only 2% of the world market share today, right? It's much, much lower. What happened? Well, basically Hong Kong and South Korea have taken the share that we used to once have. They have now come to dominate a big part of the world market. And there are many other countries in the market today, Bangladesh, India, etc., etc. So we had a very big share in the 50s, 60s, up to the 70s, and then gradually other countries were able to produce cotton more efficiently and were able to produce better quality cotton, and so they managed to corner the market, and we lost out in our market share over time. The other thing that you see about the industrial structure of Pakistan, of course, is that it is highly monopolized right from the 1950s onwards. 9 largest houses accounted for half of total production in 1959. The biggest 5 contributing as much as 37.3%. The Sehgals alone had 15% of the overall production, textile production of Pakistan. Of the 13 largest industrial houses, cotton textiles accounted for as much as 71% of total production. So this is basically what Pakistani industrialists are producing. 70% of what Pakistani industrialists are producing is cotton, right? And engineering came second with about 8%. So it's cotton mainly that you've built your industry around. By 1970, the top 4 industrial houses controlled almost 28% of cotton textiles being produced by a mere 23 industrial houses. So, those 22, 23 families, pretty much that's the industrial base of Pakistan. Now, this narrow industrial base, this was of course challenged. We've already spoken about this from 72 onwards. This is a complete list of, sort of various policies that were implemented in time in Pakistan, going all the way back to 1886. And you see that in the early period, you see that Pakistan Industrial Development Corporation actually helps to set up various mills and industries and then hands them over to the private sector. The government is very keen to develop the private sector, and the private sector is really not able to develop without the assistance of the government. The government really gives them a hand up to develop industry. And in 1972, beginning with 31 large firms in 10 basic industries were nationalized, then vegetable oil industries were nationalized, then you had banks and insurance companies that were nationalized, and then finally rice, flour, cotton ginning, etc. were also nationalized. This is not. Now, this is a big change in the policies, industrial policies of Pakistan. It though represents a very short period of time in a very long period of development, but its impact on Pakistan's economy sometimes, in my opinion, has been exaggerated. But one impact that it did have was that once nationalization occurred, employers wanted to ensure that they would never have to go through that process again. So what they did was they began to prefer outsourcing their production rather than having a big factory where everything was produced from start to finish. They preferred that some things would be produced outside of the factory. And if they were produced inside of the factory, they would again be produced by contract labor rather than by regular labor. So what that means is that the way that the industrial structure was going to be managed now after the 1970s was in what is called the flexible labor relations. Flexible labor relations means that labor is not permanent. There's no big trade unions, no big working class movement there to challenge what the factory owners, etc., are doing. So Asian Development Bank says looms were uprooted from large mills and set up as small independent production units by mill owners. So they took the looms out of the factory, set them up separately from the factory. This allows them to circumvent labor legislation, essentially. They are not my employees, they are private contractors. Now these they go into the small scale sector. So it's the large scale sector deliberately pushing certain things into the small scale sector. Why? Because they don't want to be liable for labor problems. And in the small scale sector, labor laws are not applicable, taxes really are not applicable, so they can get away with it, whereas large scale industrialists cannot. Now, this allows them to, although this allows them to circumvent labor legislation, it also contributed to the lack of growth in productivity in the textile and garments because of the fragmentation of industry from large to smaller scale units. Small scale segments of textile industry employ more than double the number of workers than the large scale manufacture, but the productivity of labor is much, much lower. And if you want to upgrade machinery, you want to upgrade the production process, that does not happen. So here you can see the large-scale mill sector, spinning, composite mills, finishing, garments, and total. And here you can see the small-scale cottage sector, etc., with power looms, finishing, towels, garments, hosiery, etc., and the total over here. And the significant thing, of course, is the employment over here. You see that the large-scale sector employs 156,000 workers here, as you can see. And the small-scale sector is employing 330,000 workers. In other words, more than double the number of workers. But if you think about it, this is really one production process. It's not two different industries. It's one production process that used to occur in one big giant factory previously and now is broken up and fragmented. And this was not such a good idea. So overall, Pakistan's textile industry has essentially failed to diversify and upgrade its equipment. UNIDO says, for example, that Pakistan's textile industry has a narrow production base, outdated technology, limited product range. You're only producing a few things, and foreign consumers have become much more quality conscious in the kinds of fabric that they are purchasing. So this is the reason why Pakistani textile industries have been losing ground to Hong Kong, to China, to Bangladesh, India, and other countries. Basically, we are now catering to the low end of the market. We're not catering to the upper end of the market at all. Garments also generate quite a bit of employment. 75% of the units are, though, comprised of small units once again. They also go into the small scale sector, even though this is again part of the same industrial process. So these units are mainly placed in Karachi, in Lahore, and Faisalabad. And if you are interested in gender and labor, these units are often manned, or not manned, but womaned rather, by women. Now all of this, whether we're talking about garments or we're talking about cotton yarn or all of it, is essentially low value added exports. So Pakistan, although it is one of the largest exporters of cotton yarn in the world, in terms of market value, it only captures 5% of the export market, because the quality of the yarn is of such low quality and the quality of the products is low. So Pak caters to the low cost and low quality cotton fabric market, which is why when you go to some of the high end, if you go to London or New York or wherever, and you go to the high end shops to buy clothes, you'll see made in China, you'll see made in Bangladesh, and so on and so forth. What you will not anymore see is made in Pakistan. There used to be a time when they were, a lot of them were made in Pakistan. But if you go to the low end sort of shops, very really poor sort of, there you might see made in Pakistan. So also our dyeing technology is now out of date. Machinery is more than 15 years old, and there is lack of diversity. And yes, a lot of the capital that ought to have been invested in moving this technology forward, sadly, went to the Middle East, and got invested in the Middle East and other parts of the world. Didn't come back to Pakistan, as was the case in the 50s, 60s, and up to the 70s, when that market really hadn't opened. But from the 90s onwards, 80s mein shuru ho gaya tha, but really from the 90s onwards, it became much, much easier to convert your profits into foreign exchange, move them out of your country, keep them in foreign bank accounts. So, or invest them abroad in Dubai or other parts of the world. So that is a very significant thing that has now attracted capital into the Middle East and away from countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so on. So finally, now to counter this whole scenario, the International Monetary Fund and World Bank economists and Pakistani economists basically all said the same thing in unison. They said the problem is that Pakistan's textile industry is overprotected. We started, if you recall, with import substitute industrialization. We were protecting it, no doubt about that. The industry was developed under a regime of cascaded tariffs under protection. So we have often heard the argument that it's overprotected and therefore it's not competitive. So the solution that was proposed was remove the tariffs, remove the barriers, lower all tariffs, lower all barriers to entry, exit, import, exports. And then Pakistani capitalists will respond to the incentives. They'll realize that they're no longer competitive in the international market and they will upgrade their machinery. But it didn't happen that way. What happened? Here is the data on the, looking at this column, which is the domestic resource costs of a particular resource, raw material, whatever. This is the effective protection rate, which is calculated by looking at the difference in price that is made as a result of the protective barrier, etc. And these are the returns on your investment, etc., etc. Now, to sum up this entire table, which is, as you can see, divided into various sectors. The decline in the EPR, pre and post reform, is not correlated with an increase in the return. It's not. So what you see is that EPR is declining, the effective protection is declining, but the returns on investment are not going up.